Yeah, so I'm very glad to be here at this conference and also to learn more about reasonableness in all the different contexts in which this term is being used. So I feel like I'm far from having anything like an overview over all of them. And so I would, because I'm saying something general about reasonableness, I'd be very grateful if someone thinks that something like that has been said somewhere in the debate, if you would point that out to me afterwards. Okay, so far I've been working mainly on practical normative reasons and what it is to act for them. And it was natural for me to have the idea to try to see how the connection between these topics, reasonableness and acting, or to have it more broadly, responding for reasons, could be construed, and that's what I will do in this talk. So acting and believing for reasons, rationality and reasonableness are obviously closely related concepts, and I think that we understand them partly by understanding how they are connected to each other. And I will focus here on reasonableness and a little bit more on the action case, on practical reasonableness than on epistemic reasonableness. But I'll try to, as I said, point out how reasonableness is related to acting and believing for normative reasons. So my aim is to look at definitions of reasonableness which have been given in the literature in terms of normative reasons, and to develop one definition myself. And I want to argue that it depends on the notion of a normative reason that we are using whether the one or the other definition seems more appropriate, and I hope that thereby I'm pointing out something new. So the different sections of my talk are these. First, I will talk about certain definitions that I found in the literature, namely given by Alexei and Sartor, which make it seem as if reasonableness has to do with responding for reasons, or at least that's how I would interpret them. Then I will have a look at reasonableness, and especially on what I think is very interesting, the different levels in which this term comes, which I will spell out what I mean by that. And by looking at these different levels, I will be formulating a challenge for the definition of reasonableness as responding for reasons. And then I will turn to two different notions of normative reasons that can be distinguished. One is the notion of normative reasons as the premises of a good deliberation, of an ideal deliberator, and I will call these good premises or ideal motives. Maybe I will switch between these terms. And then the other idea is normative reasons as the standards of right action. And here I will sometimes speak of right makers. And I think that these two notions can fall apart, and I will tell you what this means for reasonableness. Then I will apply these two notions back to reasonableness and try to come up with definitions which fit either notion. And I will address some further problems and questions and come to my conclusion. So here are some platitudes that I found about reasonableness. First, reasonableness is often said, and we've heard this today, to be concerned not only with instrumental rationality or instrumental reasons, but also with the moral good. And then reasonable actions and judgments seem to result from carefully taking into account various pro and contra considerations with different strength, and from weighing these against each other. This is what I found in a text by Alexei, who tried to give a very broad account of what reasonableness is. And I thought that's interesting. It sounds like maybe these considerations with different strength that we are weighing against each other could just be normative reasons on a certain understanding. So when it's practical reasonableness, then this definition makes it sound like we just have to identify the normative reasons for and against acting in a certain way, or for and against the judgment that a certain action is right, and then we are looking at their strengths and balancing them, and thereby we are coming to have a reasonable judgment about an action, or we are coming to perform a reasonable action. And I would like to refer to this view as the balance view, which then says that a response is reasonable if and only if it is formed for the balance of normative reasons. And of course, there can be many different reasons that speak for and against an action, so the balance view is quite demanding. And this can also be seen in the following passage that I want to quote. Reasonableness requires, Alexis says, first that all factors that might be relevant in answering a practical question be considered, and second, that they be assembled in a correct relation to each other in order to justify the judgment that provides the answer. And he also says that reasonableness thereby assesses the correctness of the judgment. So this makes it sound as if only a judgment which is also correct, for instance, the judgment that this action is reasonable, or that this action is right, that this action should be performed, will be reasonable if all the considerations which beared on the correctness of this judgment had been taken into account. And this is, of course, a very high mark and very hard to do in practice. So it makes sense to ask whether reasonableness could also be understood in a not quite as demanding way. And this is what we find when we are looking at Giovanni Sartor's sufficientist view. And here I have a quote again. Cognitive or moral optimality are not required for reasonableness. What needed is just that a determination, be it epistemic or practical, is sufficiently good or acceptable, or at least not unacceptable. And he further says, this sufficientist understanding of reasonableness, combined with the idea that practical reasonableness requires both morality and rationality, entails that reasonable practical determinations need to be both rational enough and moral enough. So this makes it a lot easier to see how we might call different views reasonable, even if they can't both be correct, and how we might say that someone acted reasonably even if we would have acted in a different way and think a different way would have been the right action. But there's something that both views have in common, and this is something that I think is still too strong or demanding, and this is what I want to point out now. So if we look at both views, the balance view and the sufficientist view, the difference is that according to Giovanni Sartor's sufficientist account, we only need to respond, the response is reasonable if it is given for enough of the considerations that speak for it. So if it's performed for sufficient normative reasons, we might say, but it always needs to be performed for some normative reasons. And here what I wondered was whether this as such is already a very strong claim. So both authors are committed to what I will call the reasons view, namely that a response is reasonable if and only if it is formed for a certain range of normative reasons. And I wondered whether this is always true. So maybe this is one way of spelling out some initial doubts about the reasons view. It won't be my main way of spelling these out in the later slides, but let's start with this. Giovanni Sartor identifies normative, or what seems to be normative practical reasons, with pairs of beliefs and desires. And I think it seems quite plausible that our mental states sometimes at least suffice to make our responses reasonable. So we might think maybe that a brain in a vet who just has to go with the mental states, the input that it gets, could have a reasonable take on the world because it's taking into account the evidence. And we might also think that an agent who is very much deceived but does the best he can might come up with a reasonable view about what he should do, even if the view is incorrect, and even if maybe this agent doesn't really form the response, the judgment or the action for any normative reasons because he doesn't have any access to them. And in the literature on normative reasons, there are many authors who say that mental states are almost never or only in very rare cases normative reasons for performing actions. Rather, normative reasons are states of affairs in the world. And so I wondered, how can we make these views fit together, and what does this show us about the reason's view of reasonableness? So now I will turn to the different levels of reasonableness, and I think that thereby it will become clearer what I think the different challenges are that arise for the reason's view, because I think that we can distinguish between less and more complex understandings of reasonableness, and that the more complex these understandings get, or the contexts maybe in which reasonableness is being applied, the less intuitively clear it is that there are always normative reasons that are being responded to by the reasonable agents. So let's see whether this makes sense. Here are a few levels that I will distinguish between. There's the objective level, which fits best with the understanding of normative reasons as facts or obtaining states of affairs in the world, because there we might say that an agent is giving a reasonable response, or here is performing an action which is reasonable if the agent knows that the action, for instance, has optimal consequences, or if the agent knows that the action is right. Oh, yeah, this is something that I wanted to mention. So I'm using consequences very often here to point out an objective fact that speaks in favor of an action to stand for normative reasons in a certain sense. This is not meant to say that this is the only normative ethics that we could have, that we could only turn to consequentialism, and that I'm taking that for granted here. It's rather, I'm using a consequentialist picture in order to make my point, but I'm aware that we might have all different kinds of ideas about what the normative reasons, the facts which determine what we ought to do really are. But I think it's easy to go with the consequences for the purpose of illustration. Okay, and then from this most simple, straightforward objective level, we might distinguish a subjective level. This is when we are saying that an action is reasonable because the agent justifiably and without false believes, and without fault believes that the action has optimal consequences, for instance, although this belief, of course, may be false if he's in very deceiving circumstances. Or, for instance, we could here think of instrumental rationality and say that the action is reasonable because it instrumentally coheres with the agent's justified beliefs and justified desires, although these beliefs still may be false. Or we might say the action is reasonable because it coheres with the agent's normative beliefs. So, depending on which rational requirements we want to use, we could say many things, But the common feature here is that we are judging about the reasonableness of the action, looking at the mental states that the agent had and that he acquired without any negligence, say. Okay, so let's move to the next levels. I should also say I'm not trying to give a full list of all the levels that we could have, but I'm trying to give you some examples of different levels in order to make my claim. So we could speak of another level as of the level of objective uncertainty or of objective certainty, and say that an action is reasonable if it's performed because the agent knows that it is certain or that it's probable enough that the action does not have, say, especially bad consequences, or maybe even that the action has very good consequences. Sometimes we would think that it's more reasonable to try to avoid bad outcomes, and in other contexts we think that it's reasonable to go for the best outcomes if we can estimate them well enough. And then there we could also think of a subjective level that's very similar. Subjective uncertainty, when we are judging that the action is reasonable because the agent justifiably and without fault believes that it is certain or probable enough that the action does not have especially bad consequences or outcomes. Or maybe that the action maximizes expected utility. And then I think we also speak of reasonableness in the case of disagreement. So here we are not taking into account subjective probabilities or objective probabilities or just the mental states of the agent, but the mental states of different people in the community. And then we might say the action is reasonable because it is sufficiently in line with or not sufficiently distant from all the justifiable beliefs of the competent individuals who find themselves in a disagreement with the agent. So again, I don't want to give any clear understanding of what we should do in a case of disagreement. It's just that we think there are certain ways that responses to disagreement bear on reasonableness. And then even more complex, I think, are the following levels. A level where we are concerned with establishing certain social rules in a society, and there we might say that it is reasonable to establish certain social rules if and then because these rules are acceptable for everyone and not established, and not establishing such rules would lead to misunderstanding or to confusion or to other relevantly bad outcomes. And similarly, we might say that complying with social rules is reasonable in these circumstances, when thereby we as a society are minimizing certain costs that we would have if we didn't follow the same rules of greeting each other, of driving on a certain side of the road, and so on. And similar thoughts apply to political procedures. There we might say it is reasonable to adopt a political or public policy if and then because it is fair and acceptable to everyone. For instance, if it is sufficiently in line with or not sufficiently distant from any of the preferences of the competent individuals who find themselves in disagreement about how the political structure should be like, then we think we have to find a structure that is as much in line with the different views in the society as possible, maybe. Or again, you could have different views, but there will be some views about when a political procedure is appropriate or reasonable, and they will have some form like this. And then there's the law, of course, and here very roughly again we might say something like this: it is reasonable to establish legal rules which prescribe a behavior, for instance to drive on a certain side of the road, if and then because these rules are acceptable for everyone and general compliance with these rules reduces harm or misunderstanding or so forth. And in applying law, maybe there are also ways of saying that a certain interpretation of a law is reasonable if it is sufficiently in line with interpretations that other authors have made, and we will find all sorts of ways in which we will judge about the reasonableness of a certain judicial decision and so on. Okay, so these is a very rough map of different levels that we might distinguish. And what does this tell us about the reason's view of reasonableness? Well, I think it is anything but clear whether we might find reasons that are being responded to which correspond to the different criteria for reasonableness that we find on these different levels, especially when we are coming to the more complex levels. So the more complex these criteria are, the more complex the account of normative reasons would have to be if we hope to find reasons at all the different levels. And it's not as if there aren't any authors writing on normative reasons who might come up with these complex views, but it's what I was worried about is rather that there are many authors who wouldn't, I think. So of course you might think that there are objective reasons, subjective reasons, reasons consisting in objective or subjective probabilities. You might think that there are reasons consisting in certain patterns of disagreement. You might think that there are reasons consisting in political and social procedures and so on. But then again, if you are just, say, an objective consequentialist, you don't think that that you have reasons of all these kinds. Yeah, I think I said this. Here are some examples. The reason, for instance, to get a vaccination might be thought to be that there is a certain probability of catching a dangerous disease. So here we would have a reason that goes with a certain objective probability maybe. Or you might think that the reason to reconsider one's belief or to suspend belief is that the interlocutor disagrees and is an epistemic peer. This might be a reason of disagreement. Or you might think that the reason to pass a certain law is partly that a certain democratic procedure, say a vote, has taken place and had a certain outcome or stuff like that. But on the other hand, there's also a mindset from which it might seem that these reasons are not fundamental normative reasons, or we speak of them as reasons, but they aren't really. So you might think there was no real reason to get a vaccination if later, after having the vaccination, one never actually got exposed to the disease. One just thought one had a reason to get a vaccination, but actually it wasn't anything that was important for one's own well-being. So it turned out in the individual case there wasn't. Or one might say that there was no reason to suspend belief if the disagreeing party got it wrong. I mean, then, yeah, maybe the one had better reasons, and it just seemed that the other person might have equally good reasons, and so one was trying to adopt to some reasons which didn't exist. So there is a puzzle whether there are reasons that correspond to all the different levels of reasonableness or not. And now I want to make this clearer by using an example that's concerned with the first levels that are not that complex yet, and I think it applies even more to the more complex levels. So sometimes I wonder whether I should take an umbrella along. And it's in the morning and I want to go to work and I wonder what to do. And so one thing that's relevant for me is that I believe that it will not rain today. This seems to be on the subjective level, and then I don't really want to rely on my belief alone, so I ask my partner, and it turns out my partner believes that it will not rain today, just as I do. And this gives me more confidence, And then I also check the weather forecast, and the weather forecast tells me that the objective probability of rain today is 20%. This is an objective probability that I now can use to make my decision. And so I leave the umbrella at home and leave the house, and then at noon it starts raining. Too bad. So I think that there are different ways that we can look, different perspectives that we can have on this example, and these will affect whether we think that what I did was reasonable or not. And in one sense, it seems that I had rather good reasons not to take the umbrella along, namely that I believed it would not rain, that my partner believed the same, and that the weather forecast indicated that it would not rain. But in another sense, it seems that I had no good reason not to take the umbrella along, since by my own lights, it's not really something that speaks in favor of leaving the umbrella at home, that doing so is in line with my own beliefs, or that it's in line with the objective probabilities that I've been told by the weather forecast, or that it's in line with the beliefs of my partner. What I wanted to do was to take the umbrella along in case it rains, and I didn't succeed. And so by my own lights, or from my perspective, the only thing that would have been a factor which speaks in favor of taking the umbrella along is rain, and the only thing that would have been a factor that speaks for leaving the umbrella home is that it doesn't rain. So, and I think this makes the dilemma clear, and now I want to try to reconcile this by looking at two different notions of normative reasons. And these different notions are not very often distinguished in the literature on normative reasons, but I think it's very helpful to make the distinction, and sometimes it's been drawn by a few authors. So here are two platitudes that many people think characterize normative reasons. First, reasons are the considerations that we should reason with, we might say. So, for instance, here is a quote by Jonathan Way: reasons are premises of good reasoning. What it is for some consideration to be a reason to phi is for it to be a premise of good reasoning towards phying. And similar views can be found in Schröder, in Setia, in Kearns and Starr. And in some discussions with Broom and Kearns and Starr, we can see how they disagree, I think, in the end, about these two different notions of normative reasons. So here is the second notion, according to which reasons explain or determine what we ought to do. This is something that we can find in literature by Broom and by Wedgwood, who made the distinction between these two kinds of reasons in a paper called The Pitfalls of Reason. But most authors who define reasons as premises of good reasoning think that they also determine what we ought to do, and so they think they are doing both of these jobs at the same time, but it's not clear that this is possible in all the different circumstances that an agent might find herself in. So that's what Rafe Wedgwood pointed out in drawing the distinction. He uses slightly different terms, but the idea is that the two categories of normative reasons do not come to the same, because we may distinguish between a criterion of rightness and a decision procedure that's good or ideal or would be used by an ideal agent. And this is, of course, familiar from two-level ethical theories and has been thought about a lot in consequentialist literature. And I should also note that Wedgwood thinks that these two categories of normative reasons are not univocal, so that we can again distinguish between many different ideal motivation reasons and normative explanation reasons, as he calls them. But I think it's more helpful to keep just one notion of these two categories fixed. And so I will try to do this by alluding to a special sense of art. I hope that it will be clear enough what I mean by this. So sometimes it's being said that when we distinguish many senses of art, we may subsequently ask which of these arts we now ought to conform to, right? So should we go with the, I don't know, aesthetic art, or with the prudential art, or with the subjective art, or with the objective art, or with which of these? And this may be used to point out that the most interesting sense of art is the one that we apply only when we want to express that it's actually important to comply with this art. Not only from a certain perspective then, or for certain purposes, but important without any qualification. So when we are asking, ought I really to do this, then we are seeming to ask a question in which one very important special sense of art is being used. And the reasons that explain or determine this sense of art are the reasons that I think we should distinguish from these ideal premises or ideal motives in deliberation, and I will call them for the rest of this talk right makers. That's not because one of them suffices to make an action or a judgment right, but because they together with the weights that they have, and maybe with considerations which speak against the judgment, determine which action is right in a kind of weighing process. So authors who say that normative reasons are usually only facts and not beliefs, and not misleading indicators or the like, seem to express the view that what we ought to do in this sense that has this practical grip, let's say, is determined by the external facts and not usually by our mental states and by probabilities and by disagreement and so on. And these authors might define reasons in the sense of ideal premises or of ideal motives by using the notion of reasons as right makers. Namely by saying that these are considerations which deliberators ought generally be disposed to be motivated by, because these dispositions, if people had them, would in the long run make them do what right makers favor and not do what they strongly disfavor, by and large, more or less. But it's the idea would be it's the best that deliberators can do to look at these ideal motives or ideal premises in deliberation and start from these if they don't have any access to the right makers themselves. And then these strategies to use these ideal premises or ideal motives will help them in the long run to conform to the right makers. So the ought in this statement shows that this notion is derived by asking which deliberative dispositions are made right by the right makers in the long run. And the idea is that we ought to have these deliberative dispositions because deliberating in these ways would in the long run result in acting in ways which are made right or less wrong than the alternatives by the reasons in the sense of right makers. And in other terms, the main distinction to be drawn is that the one between the states of affairs which ultimately determine or explain what action is right, and the deliberative dispositions which agents ideally would have, such as to do what is right, or sufficiently close to what is right as often as possible. And of course, the notion in the long run is very important for the idea of these ideal premises, or maybe I should say for the idea that they could be distinguished or not overlap always with the right makers. So if we look at the umbrella example, then the disposition to do what seems to have most expected utility given my beliefs, and the disposition to pay attention to objective probabilities, as I do when I consult the weather forecast, help in general to act more in line with the right makers, but of course they don't do so in every particular case. That's why we may call them ideal motives, in the sense that having the disposition to respond to them is helpful in the long run, but this doesn't mean that it's always helpful in the particular action that's being performed. So, as I already pointed out, ideal premises are not ideal in every particular case, and of course it would be even better to be motivated by beliefs of oneself and the beliefs of others, like when I consult my husband, and by the probabilities that I'm being told by the weather forecast, only when in the particular case they really would lead me to do the right action. But it's just not a possibility to have this disposition only in these instances, or if I don't have any general dispositions about how to respond to these kinds of informations, then it seems that that I can't, from my perspective, distinguish between the true belief and the false belief that I have, or that my husband has, or the helpfulness of the weather forecast in the particular case. So I seem to have no better chance to try to figure out what to do than to look at these ideal premises or ideal motives. So when we apply this back to reasonableness, I think what we get is that we might think that normative reasons could be used to mean reasons in the sense of ideal premises, and then the reasons view might be fine for all the different levels of reasonableness. I'm not completely sure it is, but I think it has a fair chance of, we might find we might find explanations of why the different dispositions that are being used when we respond to these kinds of considerations are helpful to do what normative reasons in the other sense actually favor. So I think then the reasons view might be fine. And insofar as the term reasonableness seems to imply that there are reasons to which a reasonable person is responding, qua being reasonable, the sense of reason at issue seems to be this sense, the ideal motive sense or the ideal premise sense. But then if we are using the term normative reasons to mean right makers, and of course there are different possibilities, but if we also accept an account according to which right makers are objective, as many authors in the literature on normative reasons do, then the reasons view seems to be wrong. And then we would need to formulate the view differently if we want to use right makers in the definition, and we might give something like this, the ideal deliberation view, which would then say that reasonable responses are formed by manifesting strategies or dispositions which often result in responses favored by right makers, and rarely in beliefs and actions or responses which are strongly disfavored by right makers. We may further characterize reasonableness by distinguishing between ideal intrapersonal strategies, which include the normal requirements of rationality or dispositions or capacities to apply these, and ideal interpersonal or collective strategies, which go more into the direction of political reasonableness and law and social structures. And especially if the right makers include actual consequences, I think it is obvious why we need some indirect strategies that help us to do what is being favored. That's because often it's hard to predict the future. Some of it maybe we know that the sun will rise tomorrow, but other things we just don't know. For instance, we often don't know what the weather will be like. We may know that what the probabilities are, but knowing this is sometimes misleading. And of course, it's very hard to know what others will do and how this will affect the consequences of our own actions and collective action cases. And so there are many situations in which it will be very hard to try to figure out what to do if we look at normative reasons and understand them as the consequences of our actions. And that's why we will need all these different strategies. And one more thing that might be interesting is that from our own perspective, I think we must often switch, given the features of the context, between different mindsets and different dispositions. So maybe we also need to have certain kind of higher order dispositions which tell us how to deliberate in a certain context and make us switch from focusing on what we think are the objective consequences to taking into account other people's views and the probabilities and so on. So depending on our certainty maybe, or on certain indicators that tell us how well we understand the situation, we might want to use more or less complex ways of deliberating, and so we will have different ways in which we are using different ideal premises in a certain situation. But I think by our own lights we often think that these changes in strategy are in the end justified by the ways in which they are instrumentally helpful in the long run in a situation like this one that we are finding ourselves in, to do what more fundamental normative reasons like the right makers maybe, which could include things like consequences of our actions, favor or disfavor. Okay, so here is just a very rough sketch of some further problems and questions which these thoughts obviously entail. So one might think, what about the sense of ought that I distinguished in order to identify right makers, and the idea that ought implies can? When right makers are independent of our deliberative perspective, they might determine what we ought to do. For instance, even that we ought to write a paper which states how to cure cancer, because doing so would be very good. And in a certain sense we can do it because we can type all the different letters that would be required for doing that. But in another sense, of course, we will say this is something that we can't do, even if it would have great consequences for humankind. Namely, because by deliberating, we are unable to find out how to do this, like the sequence of letters that we would have to type in order to write this article. This is just one of the examples in which you might think the ought that's being determined by these normative reasons in the sense of right makers is an ought that's kind of strange. And then you might also think that this ought is strange for another reason, or maybe these are related. I think they are. Insofar as it seems detached from praise and blame, because we can't be blamed for not writing down the cure for cancer, for instance. So I think the art that I'm working with is something that would be quite suspect to some people, but I, on the other hand, think that it's the art that we are using in our first person deliberation when we are thinking about what we ought to do. And of course we can switch. We can say, okay, ideally I ought to write an essay about how to cure cancer, but I won't be able to figure out how to do that. And so this is a situation in which the actual consequences aren't helpful for me as a deliberator, although they are normatively important. And so I'd better not think about this particular thing that I could do, but switch to a mindset where I'm trying to figure out things that I ought to do that are more realizable. And so here I come to my conclusion. I think that the reasonableness of a response does not consist in the fact that the response is given for normative reasons if we understand normative reasons as right makers. Responding for right makers is sufficient for reasonableness, but not necessary. So we might often have a reasonable response if we have no access to the things that really make it right, and we just use helpful clues to figure out what to do. Reasonableness is less demanding, since one might count as reasonable for employing mental strategies, which by and large tend to help to do what right makers favor. But one's behavior may be reasonable even when these strategies do not lead one to do what the right makers actually favor in the particular occasion. Thank you very much.